Hi, welcome to Channel 4 News. Today's program will be about the ancient Harappan and Aryan societies. The Harappans developed in the valley of the river Indus, whose water was available for irrigation of crops. It is hard to follow the development of this society because the earliest physical remains are inaccessible due to silt deposits raising the level of the land in the Indus Valley, and the water rising has made them inaccessible. The second reason was that there is a lack of deciphered written records. There was a system of 400 symbols to represent sounds and words. It is thought to be a Dravidian tongue related to those spoken in central and southern India. The Indus River is similar to the Nile River in that it was important for the Harappan survival. Its waters come from the snow melting in the towering mountains of the Hindu Kush and Himalayas. It is perfect for agriculture as it picks up silt from hundreds of kilometers. They could grow wheat and barley in September, kept chickens, cultivated cotton before 5000 BCE, and dyed cotton cloth in 2000 BCE.
There is no evidence of imperial or royal organization. These cities were economic and political centers for their own religions. Harappan and Mohenjo-Daro were especially prominent in Harappan society. Harappan and Mohenjo-Daro both had city walls that served as centers of political authority and redistribution, collection of taxes and grain, represented a considerable investment. There is no evidence of imperial or royal organization. These cities were economic and political centers for their own religions. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were especially prominent in Harappan society. Both had city walls that served as centers of political authority and redistribution of taxes and grain. It represented a considerable investment of human labor and other resources. Both featured marketplaces, temples, public buildings, extensive residential districts, and broad streets laid out on a carefully planned district.
They represented a considerable investment of human labor and other sources. Both featured marketplaces, temples, public buildings, extensive residential districts, and broad streets laid out on a carefully planned grid so that they ran north, south, or east, west. In the Mohenjo-Daro, many people lived in one-room tenements and barrack-like structures, but there was also individual houses of 2 and 3 dozen stories with dozen rooms and interior courtyards, as well as a few large houses with several dozen rooms and multiple courtyards. Most larger houses had their own wells and built-in brick ovens. They had sophisticated sewage systems.
The beliefs and values are the most difficult to interpret than politics and society. Scholars have been able to identify several symbols representing names or words, but not enough to understand the significance of the texts. They had fertility cults also, that associated gods and goddesses with creation and procreation. They recognized other goddesses and honored the fertility god, held animals and trees sacred because of their associations with vital forces.
They entered a state of decline after 1900 BCE. They experienced this because of ecological degradation. The Harappans deforested the Indus Valley in order to clear land for cultivation and to obtain firewood. Deforestation led to the erosion of topsoil and reduced amounts of rainfall. In 100 years, the Indus Valley became a desert.
The early Aryans practiced a limited amount of agriculture and depended more on a pastoral economy. They prized their cattle due to their wealth and rareness. They also used the horses for travel, trade, and as chariots. The chariots were devastating in wars, considering the enemies didn't have the same horsepower as the Aryans did. Later on, horses became the principal wealth of form and power and wealth. The early Aryans would consume dairy and beef as their main food. Aryans made poems and songs as religious and literary works. Their sacred language was called Sanskrit, and their basic language was called Prakrit. Their hymns, songs, etc. were used to worship their gods. The Vedas was the name given to the Aryans' earliest transmitted works. They had 4 Vedas, and the most important being the Rig Veda, contained 1,028 hymns. The Vedas represented a priestly perspective on affairs. The Vedas shed considerable light on the early Aryan society, leading the years 1,500 to 500 BCE, being called the Vedic Age. Age reflected a boisterous society in which the Aryans clashed repeatedly with the Dravidians and other people living in India. This age referred to the conflicts that happened and to their god Indra, the war god, who destroyed many villages. While there were many conflicts, the Aryans also learned about the land
and adopted Dravidian agricultural techniques. The Aryans also fought ferociously amongst themselves. They didn't have common government, but more hundreds of chiefdoms with their leaders, known as Raja. During the early centuries of the Vedic age, Aryan groups settled in the Punjab or upper Indus River Valley. They also had migrations that became the most prominent waves in the larger process of early Indo-European migrations. After 1000 BCE, they began to settle in the area between the Himalayan foothills and the Ganges River. By 700 BCE, populations had increased enough that Aryans had established their small cities in the Ganges River Valley. Population became so mass that some Aryans decided to leave and find their lives elsewhere. As they settled, they lost their tribal lifestyles and evolved more political ways. They began to have large imperial states by the 4th century BCE. Although the Aryans didn't have a large scale political structure, the Aryans constructed a well-defined social order. Their social structure rested on sharp hereditary distinctions between individuals and groups. They based it off their occupations and roles in society. These distinctions became the foundation of the caste system. The term caste comes from the Portuguese word casta, and it refers to a social class of heredity and usually unchangeable status. When Portuguese came to India, they noticed sharp distinctions of classes, which they later named the castes. Castes' identities developed gradually as the Aryans established settlements throughout India. The word Varna referred to major social classes. Over time, the Aryans recognized four main Varnas: priests, warriors, and aristocrats, cultivators, artisans, and merchants, and landless peasants and serfs. A while later, they added untouchables, basically the trash of society. Religion in the Vedic age. As the caste system did its thing, distinctive culture and religious traditions took shape. As the Aryans spread throughout India and interacted with the Dravidians, they developed new religious ideas that they considered intriguing and persuasive. This led to Hinduism, a big faith in Southeast Asia and India. Aryan religion. Religious values in India reflected the larger society. During the early centuries, they spread through the Punjab and other parts of India. The early prayers collected in the Rig Veda threw considerable light on the Aryan values. The top god of the Rig Veda was Indra. He was primarily a war god who inspired the Aryans. Another main god they had was Varuna, who cared over the sky. A big part of their religion were ritual sacrifices. They slaughtered hundreds of animals as priests spoke chants and the people watched. Their gods called for Brahmins of households to perform no less than 5 sacrifices a day. Later on, the Aryan religious thought underwent a remarkable evolution. The Aryans began to grow distaste in the sacrifices and looked for other ways to please the gods. Blending of Aryan and Dravidian values. This tradition began to appear around 800 to 400 BCE in the Upanishads and continued to appear until the 15th century. The word Upanishads means a sitting in front of, and refers to a practice of disciples gathering before a sage. Most disciples were men, but not all. The Upanishads taught that appearances are deceiving and each person participates in a larger cosmic order and is part of a universal soul known as Brahman. The authors thought that individuals were born into the physical world not once but multiple times. They developed several specific doctrines that helped to explain this line of thought. One was samsara, which held that upon death, individual souls go temporarily to the world of fathers and are reincarnated.
In 1483, fleet of Portugal came to the estuary of the Congo River and initiated relations with the kingdom. They established close political and diplomatic relationship with the kings of Congo. Before the Songhai Empire was established, Mali Empire during the 13th century replaced Ghana as a preeminent power in West Africa. By 15th century, Mali Empire began to weaken, so the Songhai state took over. During the early 15th century, they rejected Mali authority and raided Mali territory. Son Ali, who reigned from 1464 to 1493, made a campaign to conquer his neighbors and consolidated the Songhai Empire. He brought the cities of Timbuktu and Journey under his control, and used their wealth to dominate the central Niger Valley. He appointed governors to oversee provinces. He instituted a hierarchy of command that turned his army into an effective military force. The Songhai military helped extend authority north to Sahara, east toward Lake Chad, and west Niger Valley. In 16th century, Songhai Empire dominated West Africa. In 1591, Moroccan army opened fire and subject people who took the opportunity to revolt against the empire. After the fall of Songhai, small regional kingdoms and city-states emerged in West Africa. The increase of Atlantic trade in the Society of West Africa worked against the interests of the imperial states like Mali and Songhai, which relied on control of trans-Saharan trade to finance the empires. In East Africa, Swahili city-states declined when Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese mariner, visited East African coast en route to India in 1947 and 1948. He skirmished with local forces at Mozambique and Mombasa. During his second voyage to India in 1502, he forced the ruler of Kilwa to pay tribute, and followers trained cannons on Swahili ports all along the East African coast. The Portuguese forces built administrative centers at Mozambique and Malindi. They constructed forts throughout the region to control trade in East Africa, but failed and disrupted the trading patterns to decline the Swahili states. The Kingdom of Congo emerged during the 14th century. They built centralized state with officials overseeing military, judicial, and financial affairs. During the late 15th century, Congo embraced the Republic of Angola and Congo. Portuguese initiated commercial relations and established political and diplomatic relationship with the kings of Congo. They supplied kings with advisor, provided military garrison to support them and protect the Portuguese interests. King Nzinga Memba of Congo, or King Alfonso I, reigned from 1506 to 1542, a devout Roman Catholic who sought to convert all his subjects to Christianity. Relations with Portugal brought wealth and foreign recognition to Congo, also led destruction and establishment of Portuguese colony in Angola. They embarked on slaving expedition, mostly made alliances with local authorities in regions, provided them with weapons in exchange of slaves. Some of the allies were enemies of the kings of Congo, while others were royal subordinates. They undermined the authority of the kings to seize their limit in trade in slaves. In Congo, the kingdom remained strong until 17th century, but they continued trading slaves and aided Congo in expelling invaders. In 1665, port colonies to the south went to war. The Portuguese defeated Congolese army and decapitated the king. In 18th century, the Congo disintegrated. Indigenous religions devoted most of their attention to powerful spirits who were thought to intervene directly in human affairs. They associated the spirits with geographic features like mountains, waters, and forests. Others thought of the living dead as the spirits of ancestors who roamed the world. Christianity compromises with traditional beliefs and customs when it spread in sub-Saharan Africa. Port community in Congo and Angola supported priests and missionaries who introduced Roman Catholic Christianity to Central Africa. The influenced King Alfonso I and his descendants adopted European-style Christianity as a foundation for commercial and political alliances with Portugal. The Christian teachings blended with African tradition to form syncretic cults. For example, Africans regarded Christian missionaries as magicians and wore crosses and other Christian symbols as amulets to ward off danger from angry spirits. Islam is the most popular religion in commercial centers in West Africa and Swahili states of East Africa. During the 16th century, trading city of Timbuktu had 180 schools that taught Quran. African Muslims who blended Islam with indigenous beliefs costumes resulted a syncretic brand of Islam, a place for African beliefs in spirits and magic. They permitted men and women to associate with one another on familiar terms that was common in North Africa, Arabia, and Southwest Asia. The syncretic Islam struck many devout Muslims as offensive and impure. They commented at seeing women in tropical Africa who went out in public with bare breasts and socialized freely with men outside their own families. The process of slave trade during the 8th century, merchants created new supplies by raiding villages, capturing innocent individuals, and forcing them to servitude. State officials allied with the merchants by providing cavalry forces to mount raids and undefended communities. The merchants recruited slaves across Sahara Desert by camel caravans for distribution in Mediterranean basin or boarded them on ships for delivery across Indian Ocean. 10 million Africans left their home for servitudes that lasted until 20th century.
Plantation owners imported streams of slaves from Africa to maintain workforces. Most of the slaves delivered went to the tropical and subtropical regions of the Western Hemisphere, for example, in the Caribbean and the Americas. These areas cultivated cash crops such as sugar, cotton, coffee, tobacco, and many more. These plantations heavily relied on slave labor for a more efficient and profitable result.
Slaves come from war captives, criminals, and individuals expelled from their clans. A slave had no personal or civil rights and usually worked on cultivation. Muslim merchants from North Africa, Arabia, and Persia sought African slaves for sale. African slaves brought involuntary migration of 12 million Africans to the Western Hemisphere. Africa suffered loss from slave trade. Atlantic slave trade deprived African societies of about 16 million individuals. There were severe losses even though the population was increasing because of all the American food crop diets. 2/3 of the slaves were males. They were chosen because they had the best potential in heavy labor. Meanwhile, women had to take over males' responsibilities. Slave trade encouraged wars between African societies, and they competed with one another for firearms while still exchanging for slaves. The Middle Passage is a journey full of slaves crowded in a ship headed to Caribbean and American destinations. Slaves are put below deck, usually sitting upright and forced to lie with chains. There were poor conditions, so some slaves starved themselves to death. Crew members use tools to pry open the mouths of those who don't want to eat. The journey took about 4 to 6 weeks and all went through heat, cold, and disease. As the size of trade increased, ships were built bigger.
The triangular slave trade has 3 legs. The first leg comes from Europe and sends manufactured goods and horses to Africa in exchange for slaves. In the second leg, the ship sends enslaved Africans to America and sells them for 2 to 3 times more than what they had cost on the African coast. They would either demand for cash or barter with sugar. In the third leg, the ship goes back to Europe with American goods, for example, tobacco, cotton, sugar, or molasses. During the trans-Saharan slave trade, Muslim merchants distributed African slaves to the Mediterranean basin, Southwest Asia, India, and Southeast Asia. They would raid villages and capture innocent people and force them into servitude. They would transport them across Sahara Desert or on ships at Swahili. During the Atlantic slave trade, Europeans joined and expanded the trans-Saharan slave trade throughout the Atlantic Ocean basin. In the 18th century, around 88,000 slaves per year were exported from Africa to the Americas. Since Europeans settled in the Western Hemisphere, they called for slave labor to cultivate their lands. A total of around 12 million Africans were involuntarily migrated to the Western Hemisphere.
In the Caribbean and South America, slave population was unstable due to diseases such as malaria and yellow fever. Slaves faced brutal working conditions and low standards of sanitation while working on plantations.
Enslaved Africans kept their traditions such as their language and religion as they were forcefully migrated throughout the world. As they were transported, African slaves were also exposed to different culture and had to adapt to it. Eventually, this led to a hybrid of African and American traditions, which gave birth to the African American culture. Since African slaves were large in number, they were able to continue speaking in their native language. However, they mostly spoke in Creole languages such as Geechee and Gullah. These Creole languages are a blend of African and European languages. Similar to language, religion was also a combination of different societies. Many practiced a syncretic faith which did not have an institutional structure like in Christianity. They preserved the belief in spirits and supernatural powers such as magic, sorcery, witchcraft, and spirit possession. They also preserved African rituals like drumming, dancing, and sacrificing animals. slaves would resist through violent or non-violent ways. Some would escape and form self-governing communities in an isolated region. These communities would raid plantations for weapons, tools, and also slaves to increase their number. They would overwhelm colonists and masters because they are greater in number and are effective in mobilizing their military force. However, the Europeans still had the upper hand with their advanced weapons, horses, and army.
The profitability of slavery declined because of the decrease of sugar prices and increasing costs of slavery. Sugar prices declined because of the rapid expansion of its production. Around the same time, slave traders and European merchants increased the prices for slaves. Slavery itself also meant that societies have to maintain a strong military force and keep the slave alive, which are both costly. As the world switches to manufacturing industries, wage labor in factories are more suitable and more profitable. The American and French Revolution inspired abolitionists because the American Revolution emphasized liberty, life, and pursuit of happiness. Similarly, the French Revolution emphasized liberty, equality, and fraternity. For example, Olaudah Equiano strengthened anti-slavery movement. He wrote an autobiography which detailed his experiences as a slave and a free man. He would travel to British Isles, giving speeches, and denounced slavery as an evil institution.
The abolition of slave trade started with Denmark in 1803, Great Britain in 1807, the United States in 1808, France in 1814, the Netherlands in 1817, and Spain in 1845. However, slavery was still in practice and people still continued importing and exporting slaves despite of this abolition. The abolition of slavery started with the British colonies in 1833, the French colonies in 1848, United States in 1863, Cuba in 1886, Brazil in 1888, and Saudi Arabia and Angola in the 1960s. This ensured emancipation of all slaves. However, in the modern day, slavery still exists in a different form. For example, through contract labor, sham adopt, or debt bondage. Overall, African and African American slaves contributed to the building of new societies and the making of the early modern world. They contributed in the global trade network with their physical labor in cultivating crops and extracting natural resources, which was exchanged throughout the world.
The military, economic, education, and government prowess of industrialized countries served as a basis and framework for these states to pattern their social order and system. However, humiliating treaty provisions were one of the disadvantages of their influence.
The factors of the Ottoman Empire's decline are the military reverses, pressures from ethnic, religious, and nationalist groups, the loss of territories, and economic decline. The Ottoman Empire could no longer expand their territory because of its military's decline. Firstly, the Europeans had more advanced strategy, tactics, and weapons. Secondly, the Janissaries started to deteriorate. They began to instigate palace coups, and also they started to neglect training and not use the new military advantages. The Ottoman Empire also lost territories which facilitated its decline. In the Caucasus and Central Asian territories, it was taken over by Russian forces since it was poorly defended. A nationalist uprising caused the Ottoman rulers to recognize their independence in the Balkan provinces, especially in Greece and Serbia. Egypt was the most significant territorial loss in the Ottoman Empire. Napoleon's failed attempt of invasion in Egypt in 1798 caused turmoil and also the local elites battling for power. The winner was Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali industrialized Egypt, built a powerful army, and established himself as the ruler in 1820. This made Egypt an autonomous region within the Ottoman Empire. Trade declined throughout the later 17th and 18th centuries. European merchants didn't use the Ottoman intermediaries and directly traded with China and India.
During the 18th and 19th century, the European producers became more efficient and their textiles and manufactured goods began to flow into the Ottoman Empire. Because the items were cheap and high quality, they placed considerable pressure on Ottoman artisans and craft workers and led urban riots to protest foreign imports. The Ottoman exports consisted of raw materials such as grain, cotton, hemp, and more. They didn't offset the value of imported European manufacturers. During the middle 19th century, the Ottoman Empire depended heavily on foreign loans. European capital financed the construction of railroads, utilities, and mining enterprises. The interest payments grew to the point that they consumed more than half of the empire's revenues. The Ottoman state couldn't pay interest on its loans in 1882, so they accepted foreign administration of its debts. In 16th century, the Ottoman Sultan signed capitulation treaties to avoid suffering from administering justice for communities of foreign merchants. During 19th century, Ottoman officials regarded capitulations as humiliating intrusions on their sovereignty. Capitulations served as instruments of economic penetration by European business people who established tax-exempt banks and commercial enterprises in the Ottoman Empire. They permitted foreign governments to levy their duties on goods sold in Ottoman ports.
In the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire had a difficulty in paying salaries of employees, military, and religious hierarchy because of the lack of resources. As a result, taxes were increased, which also increased the exploitation of peasantry and the decline in agricultural production. The Ottoman Empire attempts to strengthen and preserve the state through reforms. It started with limiting taxation, increasing agricultural production, and ending official corruption. They also attempted to remodel the military as the European-styled army in 1826. This threatened the Janissaries, who started a revolt. As a result, Mehmed II ordered the massacre of the Janissaries and continued on to the military reform as top priority. Recruits were sent to military and engineering schools. Reform for the government and education systems also arose during the Tanzimat or reorganization era. They drew inspiration from the Enlightenment and constitutional foundation in the Western European states. The legal reforms were to attack Ottoman law and make it more acceptable to Europeans in order to gain sovereignty. For example, they established the Penal Code, Commercial Code, and Maritime Code. They also created a civil code which safeguarded the rights of subjects. They have public trials, equality before the law, and right of privacy. Educational reforms led to complete primary and secondary schools and also free primary education. However, as more educated subjects arose, they started to question the government system and emphasized the need for a written constitution that would define and limit the Sultan's power. In 1889, the Young Turk Party arose. They called for universal suffrage, equality before the law, freedom of religion, free public education, and many more. They were able to force Abdul Hamid to restore the parliament and constitution of 1876, which limited the Sultan's power and established a representative government. In 1908, they dethroned him and replaced him with another sultan. Despite these efforts, the decline of Ottoman Empire continued, as they lost wars and subject people continued to seek for autonomy or independence.
Russia, known for military power, planned to overtake the Ottoman Empire. However, this led to conflict with Europe. Thus, European countries defeated the headquarters of Russia, which is the Crimean Peninsula.
The Russian Empire's defeat against the British, French, Sardinians, and Ottomans at the Crimean War was due to the inability of the empire's economy to support their expansionist ambition. This prompted the re-evaluation of social order and restructuring program in Russia.
The emancipation of serfs was the key to social reform in Russia. Opposition to serfdom had grown steadily since the 18th century, not only radicals but also high officials. Serfdom was a source of rural instability and peasant revolt, where hundreds of insurrections broke out during the first 4 decades of the 19th century. Tsar Alexander II, who reigned from 1855 to 1881, suggested to the nobility of Moscow, it is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait until the serfs begin to liberate themselves from below. During the 1861, Tsar Alexander II abolished the institution of serfdom. Some of the pros of the emancipation of serfs was that the serfs won their freedom, their labor obligations gradually cancelled, and the government compensated for their work. Some of the downsides are the serfs having few political rights and pay redemption tax for the lands they received. Most of the serfs found themselves in debt for the rest of their lives.
The government established the Zemstvos in 1864 to deal with local issues of health, education, and welfare of the empire. This elected district assembly was allowed for all classes to become a representative. Another form of political reform is the revision of the judiciary system, which created a system of law courts based on Western European models. Another legal reform is the institution of trial by jury for criminal offenses and welfare justice of peace for minor offenses. These reforms encouraged the emergence of legal experts and the decline of judicial corruption. Russia also underwent industrialization to try to strengthen the empire. Count Sergei Witte, the Minister of Finance, implemented policies designed to stimulate economic development. For example, the development of railways encouraged the development of other industries and also spread settlement exploitation and industrialization to other areas. These policies also remodeled the state bank, supported baby industries, and used foreign loans to finance industrialization. This plan was a success. However, Witte's policies received discontent from the working class through rebellions or workers' strikes. The growth of industries created a new urban working class. These workers experienced low standards of living and also were paid extremely low prices for a great amount of work. The government limited the working hours but didn't do anything to improve their conditions. Peasants rebelled and protested against the government. Anarchists believed that all forms of government should be abolished and local governing councils should have authority. These parties branched off to terrorism or separatist movements as the government attempted to repress it. Some ways they tried to repress these movements are through censoring secret police, restricting educational opportunity, and prohibiting other language. However, it was unsuccessful and these people started to protest more radically. Some would resort to violent means to pressure the government into political reform. After the Bloody Sunday massacre, labor unrest, peasant insurrections, student demonstrations, and mutinies in army and navy increased. Peasants and urban workers started organizing themselves and even created new councils known as Soviets. These revolutions pressured and forced the government to establish the Duma, Russia's first parliament. Eventually, the government restored order in Russia. The military defeats of the Qing dynasty resulted to unequal treaties which allowed exploitation of the Chinese economy. This hindered the dynasty's ability to deal with domestic order and undermined the empire's sovereignty. This prompted the ruling elites to develop reforms to maintain social order and preserve the Qing dynasty.
The Chinese were using the Kohong system, so Europe strategized a plan to infiltrate the Chinese commercial system, which led to selling opium goods.
The British East Indian Company found an alternative payment, which is trading opium for Chinese goods. The trade of opium was illegal, but corrupt local officials let it slide. Eventually, the government became aware and sent Lin Zexu to destroy the trade. This led to the Opium War between Britain and China. Britain was more advanced and easily won the war after striking the Grand Canal. Britain then forced China to accept the Nanjing Treaty, which ceded Hong Kong to Britain and granted extraterritoriality to Britain's subjects.
Which means they were not subject to Chinese laws.
Britain opened 5 Chinese ports, including Guangzhou and Shanghai, to commerce and residence. They also compelled the Qing government to extend most favored nation status to Britain. Unequal treaties wrote in the concessions given to foreign powers. They legalized the opium trade, they permitted the establishment of Christian missions throughout China, and opened additional treaty ports. Various treaties prevented the Qing government from levying tariffs on imports to protect domestic industries. During the 1900s, the Chinese ports were under the control of foreign powers. Foreign merchants controlled much of the Chinese economy.
The effects of these treaties brought the uprise of the Taiping Rebellion.
The Taiping Rebellion was the most dangerous event that stormed throughout most of China. This almost led to the collapse of the Qing dynasty. The cause of the rebellion was mainly because of foreign intrusion that led to the increase of poverty and corruption. Hong Xiuquan gave leadership to the Taiping Rebellion. He was first a village teacher who attempted to take civil service examinations. He failed 4 times, and this turned him to a madman. He believed that God ordered him to be the leader of the destruction of the Qing dynasty. He then gathered 10,000 individuals for the rebellion. However, the Qing dynasty came unprepared, so they asked help from the Manchus. This led to the Taipings losing and Hong Xiuquan committing suicide. In the end, 20 to 30 million lives are gone and declined agricultural production.
The aggressiveness of foreign powers and domestic rebellion made Qing rulers realize the need for change. They established reform programs to solve the social and economic problems of the empire. For example, the self-strengthening movement. This movement flourished in the 1860s and the 1870s. Local leaders used their power or influence to promote military and economic reform. It laid foundation for industrialization as they blended Chinese culture with European industrial technology. They built modern shipyards, railroads, weapon industries, and many more. However, it didn't introduce enough industry to bring real military strength and only brought superficial change. In the 19th century, foreign powers began to dismantle the Chinese system of tributary states. In 1885, France took over Vietnam. In 1886, Great Britain took over Burma. In 1895, Japan took over Korea, Taiwan, and Liaodong. China was too weak to resist foreign demands and also allowed them to have exclusive rights to the railway and mineral development in the empire. In the 100 Days Reform, Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao justified these radical changes in China through the form of treaties using Confucian thought. Emperor Guangxu was impressed by these ideas and launched a program to transform China into a constitutional monarchy. He also guaranteed civil liberties, remodeled the educational system, encouraged foreign influence, and modernized the military. He also stimulated economic development. It got violent reactions from members of the imperial household and their allies. Emperor Dowager Cixi nullified the reforms decrees and imprisoned the emperor.
During the early 19th century, decline of agricultural productivity, crop failures, famines, and harsh taxation led to starvation among the rural population. Few cultivators prospered, but many had to sell their land and become tenant farmers. Peasants migrated into cities or towns in search for jobs. From 1841 to 1843, the Tokugawa shogun's chief advisor, Mizuno Tadakuni, measured to stem growing social and economic decline and shore up the Tokugawa government. He canceled debts that samurai and daimyo owed to merchants and abolished several merchant guilds and compelled peasants residing in cities to return to the land and cultivate rice.
The Meiji Restoration marked the birth of New Japan. After a series of losses, Emperor Meiji implemented numerous changes in the government, education, and commerce. In short, he deconstructed the old social order. Despite the progress, the Meiji wasn't able to subside the suffering of rural population. Protesters, who are people of the mass, mostly peasants, and are guided by a group of educated people who wanted reform. All tried to protest, but their culture and nationalism affected their ways. It was only Japan who was able to check and balance after their suffering. They sent people abroad who then applied their learnings. Also, instead of allowing humiliating treaty provisions from foreigners, they just allowed them to evaluate and facilitate the reconstruction of a new social order.
It was a warm and radiant Sunday morning that took a turn for the worse when Archduke Francis Ferdinand and Duchess Sophie were premeditatedly attacked in the streets of Sarajevo. The first attack failed to assassinate the Duke. However, the second one succeeded by the hands of Gavrilo Princip, as the Duke and Duchess were on their way to visit the injured from the first attack. A mob of angry onlookers attacked Princip, who fought back and wrestled away by the police. Meanwhile, the Duke and Duchess lay fatally wounded in their limousine as it rushed to seek help. They both died within the hour. The assassination set off a rapid chain of events. Austria-Hungary blamed the Serbian government for the attack and hoped to use the incident as justification for settling the question of Slav nationalism once and for all.
Please, dear Sophie, do not die. We need you for our children.
Life in a trench, I'd like to explain in one word: horrific. It's mud, it's death, it's rats, it's stench, and soldiers develop an attitude in a trench that everybody is going to die.
Life in the trench was abysmal. There were several lines of trenches, and the front line trenches, of course, were the most dangerous because they were constantly under fire. Into me!
The Germans dug assiduously, building dry, safe, and comfortable trenches for themselves with bunkers that actually had electricity and sometimes running water. The British and French, who were convinced that they were never going to be there for that long, didn't spend nearly the same effort. And so their trenches tended to be muddy and wet and not that safe.
Disease ran rampant. It was very difficult to get any sort of sleep, a decent hot meal, keep your clothes dry, and more importantly, to keep your sanity.
There were so many health problems of just simple disease that took much more men out of combat than direct fire.
I think one word that would surprise people about life in a trench: boredom. A lot of time is spent just sitting, cleaning tools, and being scared to death the battle's going to start any minute.
Was just the day-to-day monotony of being trapped in this very small space and fighting for a war that's really fought in inches.
The idea of open warfare, of fighting out into what they called no man's land, wasn't working. The technology of the war had advanced so much with machine guns, artillery that could lob shells a mile. It became mostly a defensive war early on, and as a defensive war, you wanted to protect your troops, so the miles and miles of trenches were built.
There were often bodies buried in the sides of trenches, bodies lying out in the open in front of the trenches. The soldiers were experiencing not only the war that they were fighting at the moment, but the war that had been going on throughout those trenches for all of the years of the war.
A young lieutenant writes his mother and says, "I haven't been killed yet, but it's only a matter of time." That's typical of the way soldiers felt about life in the trench. You just did it. You existed day to day, tried to go on, keep your chin up, but one day, a bullet was going to have your name on it, and you were going to perish. You weren't going home.
Dearest family, I hope this letter reaches you. I apologize for not writing to you sooner, although finding time to write is becoming increasingly more difficult as we push towards the German front line. Every day we are bombarded by shells, and the conditions that we have to endure in the trenches are unbearable. Due to the fact that we stand in the mud for hours upon hours, many soldiers contract a disease called trench foot. Perhaps the most sickening part of the trench, though, is the buildup of human bodies, flung on top of the trench in order to provide a basic blockade. Occasionally, a body or two falls back down, but it must be hoisted back up. It is disgraceful to think what has been done to these men who joined the war to fight valiantly for their country, and are repaid by being used as a primitive defense. The trenches are designed in such a way that if shots are being fired down on it, they will not travel all the way down, killing as many men. Breaking up lines of the trenches are dugouts that are used to stay in when we are being shelled. Higher-ranking officials also stay in these dugouts. It seems the higher ranked an officer, the more cowardly he becomes. Any respect I have had for my seniors is now gone. When we attempt to gain ground, hundreds of men are being lost, and for what? I promise you I will come back to you. I love you.
Sergeant Adams, we have to go.
5 minutes later.
treaty required that Germany pay financial reparations, disarm, lose territory, and give up all of its overseas colonies. It also called for the creation of the League of Nations, an institution that President Woodrow Wilson strongly supported and had originally outlined in his 14 points address. The treaty ended the state of war between Germany and the Allied powers.
After 4 years of trench warfare, the Allies claimed victory over the Central Powers, which concluded the war in 1919. The treaty was presented to Germany on May 5th and was eventually signed on June 28th. At the start of the meetings at the Paris Peace Conference, there were 27 countries. It quickly decreased to 10 reps from 5 countries, including the US, Great Britain, France, Italy, and Japan.
Good day. This is Lieutenant Schneider. May I please speak to Catherine and Susan Adams?
Susan?
This letter is from your father, Brad Adams. I am so sorry for your loss.